Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Getting ready. Bloomberg sources say senior U.S. officials are preparing for the possibility of a potential strike on Iran in the coming days. But President Trump has yet to make up his mind.
You don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble.
The Fed keeps interest rates unchanged for a fourth straight meeting, with policymakers divided on the rates and inflation outlook. Chair Jerome Powell seems to be certain about one thing, and that is higher prices.
We have to be forward-looking, and the thing that every forecaster, every outside forecaster, and the Fed is saying is that we expect a meaningful amount of inflation to arrive in coming months.
It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johanna Bersachi in Dubai. Well, two main stories that we're focused on this morning. It is the day after the Fed and, of course, our Bloomberg reporting suggesting that U.S. officials are now actually putting in works plans to go along with the military strike in Iran in the coming days. So big development overnight on that front. We're going to be discussing it on the show. As for the Fed, no surprise really on the interest rate front. They left rates unchanged as was expected. Perhaps a bit of a surprise to the market is that the median interest rate forecast is still sitting at 2 rate cuts for the rest of this year. But somewhat interesting to square that up with their own inflation forecasts, which have been significantly revised upwards. So you've got two things going on there. You've got unchanged rate forecasts, but at the same time, much higher imminent inflation forecasts coming out of the Fed. So the reaction in the markets actually was pretty limited. The S&P, as you can see now, not doing a whole lot, down about 15 basis points, despite the fact that geopolitical risk premium seems to be building up in this part of the world. The handover this morning from Asia Pacific, pretty negative as well, down 1% for the broad composite. Hang Seng down a lot more, down more than 1.6% this morning. USD seeing a marginal bid as well, as we talk about money going into the safe haven, up about 6 basis points. And then Brent dipping a little bit today, down 0.3%, but still above that $76 handle as we speak about the more than 10% jump that the price of oil has witnessed over the past week. And we are indeed entering into almost a week of attacks and counterattacks between Israel and Iran. Now, speaking of which, Bloomberg has learned that senior U.S. officials are preparing for the possibility of a strike on Iran in the coming days. President Trump has publicly considered an attack, saying he has ideas as what to do and that all options remain on the table. Trump met with top advisors to discuss these options, but says he's yet to make a final decision. He also says Iran is ready to negotiate.
Iran's got a lot of trouble, and they want to negotiate. And I said, why didn't you negotiate with me before? All this death and destruction. Why didn't you negotiate? I said to the people, why didn't you negotiate with me 2 weeks ago? You could have done fine. You would have had a country.
Paul Wallace is Bloomberg's Middle East managing editor. Paul, speculation rampant the last couple of days about what the U.S. are going to do, whether they actually do want to get involved militarily. Big story from our Bloomberg colleagues overnight. What do we know?
Very much so. So the U.S. is preparing for potential strikes. So I think we've got to the point now where whatever the U.S. might do, those plans are in place, and they can go instantly if Donald Trump decides that that's what he wants to do. We're still very unclear at the moment exactly what those plans are, whether it would be the U.S. Focusing on limited strikes on specific nuclear facilities such as Fordo or maybe the Natanz underground facilities, for example, or if it would be something wider, targeting many more military facilities and perhaps even senior Iranian officials. And let's not forget, in the past few days, there's been plenty of speculation about whether the U.S. would try or Israel would try, between them, they'd try and take out Iran's supreme leader. So there's lots of options, but it's pretty clear at the moment that the U.S. can go very quickly if that's what Donald Trump decides.
And yet, we heard from the Iranian supreme leader yesterday. He said that he predicts irreparable damage on U.S. assets should they deem the U.S. to have been involved militarily in strikes. How should we read those comments and the rest of what he said?
I think it's important. So he put out a statement yesterday, the Supreme Leader. There was a lot of defiance, I think. Well, that's how I read it in his words. He essentially said there will be no surrender. And yes, he's threatened to attack U.S. assets across the region if the U.S. either joins in with the Israeli strikes or carries out, strikes on its own. And important to note, that is something that is very much front and center of the minds of some of Donald Trump's main supporters, some of his MAGA base. There's a bit of a split within them, and there are plenty of, let's call it his high-profile supporters who do not want the U.S. to do this and think this would just embroil the U.S. in another foreign war. So that's something that Donald Trump will be weighing with his most senior advisors.
I was looking at a YouGov poll that was put out overnight suggesting that the U.S. public on both sides of the aisle, by the way, are very much, the overwhelming majority is opposed to the U.S. getting involved militarily in this war. Just to round things up, Paul, what are we actually seeing in terms of attacks and counterattacks between Israel and Iran over the last couple of days? From what I've seen, the intensity of Iranian attacks on Israel seems to have slowed down, but not vice versa.
Yes, I think that's essentially what it is. So when it comes to Iranian attacks on Israel, Iran is still firing ballistic missiles daily, but the number of those has dropped quite significantly since Friday and Saturday and Sunday. And we've done a few stories on this, and we did one yesterday pointing out that Israel has taken the first steps, if you like, to reopen the economy. It wasn't totally shut down, but it's easing some of the rules that are put in place to make sure people were as safe as possible. And this is either a sign that Iran's launch sites are damaged because Israel has been very much prioritizing hitting those launch sites, and or that Iran is trying to preserve its stockpiles. When it comes to attacks on places like Tehran and other sites in Iran, they are still continuing the whole time. And one thing that was important in the last few hours was that Israel asked or put out a Farsi social media post calling on people in the Arak region to evacuate. That's a site of a key nuclear facility. There's a deep water reactor there, and we don't know what Israel is planning, of course, but it is possible that they will look for a strike on that facility, and that there is a danger of some kind of radiological leak or something like that.
Yeah. We have an interesting story up on the terminal about radiological leaks and where they could emanate from. In addition to the interview that our colleagues conducted with the IAEA Director General yesterday, he was talking about some of the damage sustained at these nuclear sites. We'll play that later in the show. Paul Wallace, Bloomberg's managing editor for economy and government in the Middle East and Africa. Thank you. Now, Fed Chair Jerome Powell has signaled that higher prices are coming due to tariffs, and policymakers are waiting to see how much of the cost will fall on consumers. That is after the central bank held interest rates steady for a fourth straight meeting, with policymakers divided on the outlook for interest rates and inflation.
Despite elevated uncertainty, the economy is in a solid position. We expect a meaningful amount of inflation to arrive in coming months. What's tended to happen is when there's turmoil in the Middle East, you may see a spike in energy prices, but tends to come down. The amount of the tariff effects, the size of the tariff effects, their duration and the time it will take are all highly uncertain. So that is why we think the appropriate thing to do is to hold where we are. The current stance of monetary policy leaves us well positioned to respond in a timely way to economic developments.
For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel. Val, good to have you with us. There wasn't a huge reaction, I should say, in markets yesterday, and perhaps participants are trying to get their head around the fact that the Fed both upgraded their inflation forecast, but somehow kept those two rate cuts embedded into their projections. So how do you square the two up?
Yeah, you're right, Jumana. I also add that they added a line into the statement about uncertainty around the economic outlook having declined. So really giving maybe a knock to the fact that tariff policy uncertainty has declined since their previous meeting. But yes, as you mentioned, it was the first time they've released these economic projections since Trump's tariff policy was announced in early April. They revised down growth, revised up inflation, and revised up the unemployment rate. The dot plot median was kept the same. 2 cuts penciled in for the remainder of the year. But Jumana, a fair few on the FOMC joined the camp of no cuts for the remainder of the year. A total of 7 members actually penciled in no cuts. That's up from 4 members in the previous projections. Powell did mention, though, that because of the uncertainty, no one holds those rate paths with a lot of conviction. So still a lot of uncertainty ahead for the U.S. economy. He was slightly more hawkish when it came to the press conference. Nothing super specific, but emphasized that employment is strong. He did keep that language around the labor market, saying it is strong, and did mention it will take some time to show whether tariffs are going to translate into persistent inflation or whether it's just going to be a one-off rise in prices. He emphasized again that monetary policy is well suited to handle the uncertainty ahead, but mentioned just how unclear it is that whether tariffs will be passed on to the final consumer or absorbed in the supply chain, and mentioned we might have to be waiting for a fair few months for a reading on that. He did lastly mention that the Middle East conflict might not lead to prolonged pressure on energy prices due to the U.S. not being as reliant on the region as a source of energy.
I thought it was really interesting as well that he suggested that there's no one in the FOMC who has really strong convictions about where the path is for interest rates because of the uncertainty in the environment. Not an easy time to be a central banker, Val, but we've got another meeting coming up today, the Bank of England. They did cut interest rates in May, not tapped to cut interest rates once again today. But what will you be watching out for?
Most people will be watching the vote split, Jumana. Last time around, there was a 3-way vote split. You had members voting for a hold, members voting for a 25 basis point cut, and some members voting for a 50. Now, many think we are unlikely to get a 3-way vote split again. The consensus is around a 7-2 vote split at the MPC. But note there has been a lot of news since they've last met. Probably the most important one for the MPC was the very, underwhelming payroll report a few weeks ago showing payroll growth declining at the fastest rate since COVID. We also had services inflation yesterday coming in a bit softer than expected. So those two things might keep Bailey, again, reiterating that a gradual pace of cuts is warranted for the UK economy, with that implying a quarterly pace of cuts. So that's 2 remaining to the remainder of the year.
Yeah, well, they seem to be following a every other meeting approach. So let's see what comes out of today. Val, always good to have your perspectives. Thanks so much for joining us. Bloomberg's Val Teitel. Now, still ahead, coming up, hear why Macrovisor remains cautiously bullish on U.S. equities despite division amongst Fed officials on the outlook for interest rates and inflation. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johanna Bersachi in Dubai. Equities are under pressure along with risk-sensitive currencies as the U.S. weighs the potential for direct conflict with Iran, and Fed Chair Jerome Powell warns of meaningful inflation ahead. Joining us is Ayesha Tariq, co-founder of Macrovisor. Maybe let me just start out with a direct question. What did you make of the Fed yesterday?
Hi, Jumana. Thank you for having me back. So it was quite a bit of a confusing meeting, I think. I mean, not a lot of new information. And I think one of the things that a lot of people have been talking about is whether tariffs actually turn out to be inflationary or deflationary, meaning whether we see demand destruction, or we go straight to demand destruction or not. But I think the Fed kind of answered that question as to what they are thinking. And you already talked about it earlier in the show, saying that the Fed really thinks that inflation will flow through. Now, what we do see, though, is that the Fed is remaining cautious here, confused and cautious. And I think, rightfully so, because we still don't know what's going to happen next with the tariffs. And now we have the new situation of oil prices going up because of the geopolitical risks.
Yeah. Ayesha, I've seen a few analysts put out commentary saying that in the absence of the unknowns surrounding tariffs, surrounding what happens to the price of oil, if the Fed had just been analyzing the concurrent data, they probably would be cutting by now, because the most recent spot inflation prints have actually been surprising to the downside. Do you believe that that is the case?
Yes, Jumana, because if you note, the Fed has been on a path of rate reduction, right? So they started this rate cutting cycle last year, and everything was kind of going okay. I mean, I think they did a jumbo cut that was, in my opinion, not the right thing to do at the time. However, they had started their easing cycle, right, like the rest of the world. However, they got derailed by, the tariffs and the uncertainty that's been presented by the new administration. And now I think we have a third thing that's kind of bringing in some more uncertainty, which is the one big beautiful bill and all the fiscal spending that goes with it. So I think it's right that analysts are thinking that the Fed should have been cutting, but it's just that they've been on pause now, and because they've been derailed because of all this uncertainty.
Ayesha, as a market participant, how much do you get impacted by President Trump's ongoing jabs at Powell? Do you sort of brush them off now because he does it all the time, or is it something really to worry about?
So, Johanna, I think you put it well. It's like that everything loses its edge after a while. So it's like the boy who cried wolf, right? So when you say it a few more times, it kind of loses its potency. So I think we still understand that President Trump wants lower rates, and I understand where he's coming from because of the data that we're seeing. However, it doesn't affect us as much anymore because we know what Chair Powell and the Fed kind of is thinking here. So it has lost a little bit of its potency, yes.
Okay, let's bring it back to markets. Markets seem to be shrugging off a whole bunch of risks, be they tariff risks with the 90-day extension coming to an end July 9, geopolitical risks as well. Do you expect markets to keep climbing higher from here, equity markets, to be clear?
So I think U.S. equities want to go higher, and that's why we do remain bullish, but cautiously bullish. And the reason I say cautiously is because I think we do see quite a bit of choppiness because of all these risks. But eventually, the market is trying to float higher. And a couple of the reasons for that is because we haven't seen a major re-rating in the earnings estimates. I think everybody thought this is going to be much worse, but it hasn't turned out to be so. We've also got, flows coming through because of the summer, and because when the market corrected lower, we saw quite a few companies buy back at these lower prices. And I think the most important thing is the new administration has given the idea that they are open to negotiations. So when the tariffs hit in April, obviously it was shock and awe. And many were thinking, is there going to be, room for negotiation? How strong is the stance over there? But what we've seen over the last couple of months is that they are open to, lower rates. And I think they're gradually realizing as well that these higher reciprocal rates are not really conducive to trade right now and not great for the economy either.
Ayesha Tariq, very clear and always good to speak to you, co-founder for Macrovisor. And coming up, South Africa's Grand Prix Circuit is planning a major overhaul as it bids for its first F1 race in 3 decades. That's next. This is Bloomberg. South Africa's Kyalami Grand Prix Circuit is planning an overhaul costing as much as $10 million as the country prepares to bid for its first Formula One race in 3 decades. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Lonnie Prinsloo, who is in Johannesburg. Lonnie, talk us through maybe the upgrades that are necessary to get the Kyalami F1 race ready.
Hi, Jumana. Yeah, so Kyalami is actually hosting races at the moment, and they're graded according to FIA at grade 2. So they need to be upgraded to grade 1. And actually, it's not going to take too much. They need to do some corner barriers. They're doing a space review to see how they can host 100,000 people instead of the 50,000 that they host currently a day with the race. So so they've done the work with Apex, and now they are just getting ready to do the all the sort of work needed to get Formula One back to Africa, basically.
Is there anyone apart from South Africa, anyone else on the continent who's also trying to get a bid in to get the continent to host Formula One?
100%. So even within South Africa, there are different parties bidding. Kyalami is the oldest racing track that we have, and it was also previously, about 30 years ago, used for Formula One racing. Then in Cape Town, there are a couple of bids there. There's a street race that they are proposing. They are also proposing a new track there. Generally, Cape Town is seen as more scenic and iconic, so we have those guys trying to put a bid in from there. And then there's also Rwanda. So Rwanda has some Middle Eastern backing to try and get them on the race calendar, although there's been some political instability in Rwanda, so we'll see if they can come through. Also in Morocco, we don't know too much about Morocco's bid or how serious they are, but there has been some rumors that Morocco will also try. In the short to medium term, the man that is the owner of Kyalami Racetrack and also Porsche South Africa said to me yesterday, in the shorter term, he thinks Kyalami is the only one that would be able to host this race. But we have to see what all the other bidders can come up with.
Bloomberg's Lonnie Prinsloo, thank you for bringing us a lighter story on a very heavy news day today. That was Lonnie Prinsloo talking about South Africa's bid for Formula One. Taking a look at markets, things are leaning towards the red. Handover negative from Asian equities. You can see most futures are also marginally in negative territory as well. Switching over, let's just talk through the oil complex. Clearly, energy traders rattled by the developments in the region. Brent sitting at around $76. When we come back, we're going to be speaking to Dalia Fahmy, Director of International Relations and Diplomacy from Long Island University. Coming up. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Getting ready. Bloomberg sources say senior U.S. officials are preparing for the possibility of a potential strike on Iran in the coming days. But President Trump has yet to make up his mind.
I mean, you don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble.
The Fed keeps interest rates unchanged for a fourth straight meeting, with policymakers divided on the rates and inflation outlook. Chair Jerome Powell seems to be certain about one thing, though: higher prices.
We have to be forward-looking, and the thing that every forecaster, every outside forecaster, and the Fed is saying is that we expect a meaningful amount of inflation to arrive in coming months.
Well, it's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Johanna Bersachi in Dubai. The main story this morning in the region, a Bloomberg article that we put out overnight, sources confirming to Bloomberg that U.S. officials are now really preparing for the possibility of U.S. intervention, military intervention, in the coming days. So latest flashes suggesting that could happen as soon as this weekend. Obviously would be a huge moment geopolitically in this part of the world. Separate to that, we also had the Fed meeting take place yesterday, and we've been speaking about that earlier on the show. The main takeaway seems to be that the Fed so far are in a wait-and-see approach, a holding pattern, even though they've kept their median dot plot unchanged for the rest of this year. 2 rate cuts still penciled in by the end of this year, that they've moved them higher in subsequent years. And they've also substantially upgraded their inflation forecast for the end of this year as well. So S&P futures today leaning towards the red, down 0.2%, but very negative handover from Asia Pacific equities. You can see there that index is down more than 1.1%. The Hang Seng deeply in negative territory as well. The USD getting a little bit of a bid this morning, up 6 basis points after that Fed meeting, especially with the Fed chair suggesting that there is a huge degree of uncertainty still about the projection for interest rates and the rate path ahead. And then Brent obviously is still very much in focus given the concerns of the region. $76 thereabouts is where Brent is, up more than 10% in the last week. And the war between Iran and Israel has been going on for almost a week now. So as this war continues, Iran's proxy militias, including Hezbollah, have been absent from the conflict. The once formidable force has not fired on Israel or threatened to, and its leaders have only offered public support for Tehran. Now, the decline of Hezbollah leaves only the Houthis in Yemen as a significant Iran-backed group that could attack Israel. Let's dig deeper into this with Dalia Fahmy, Bloomberg's UAE bureau chief. We've obviously spent a lot of time the last couple of days talking about Iran's ballistic missile systems, their defense systems, their nuclear sites, but not a lot about the proxies, and namely because the proxies have been remarkably quiet, specifically Hezbollah. Why have Hezbollah been so quiet this time around?
As you say, remarkably quiet and remarkably degraded. Let's remember what happened back in September when Israel's war on Hezbollah began. The military capability has almost been wiped out. Israel has said we've destroyed most of their missile stockpile, their drone stockpiles. And I don't know if you remember those scenes from the IDF, the videos, that they were really destroying entire villages because they were detonating underground tunnels that Hezbollah built, and that's where they stored most of their arsenal. So arsenal-wise, military capability-wise, that's been degraded. And secondly, we have to look at Hezbollah's command and leadership status now. Those have been decapitated, especially with the killing of their most revered leader, Hassan Nasrallah, and most of their commanders, their high-ranking military commanders. And third of all, we have to look at the support base, that support base that's always been a fuel for the group. The morale is not there for war. Reconstruction hasn't started. They are distributing very little amount of money to people to rebuild their homes, be it in Beirut's southern suburbs or in South Lebanon. And that is a massive, if we're comparing it to 2006, after the Israel-Hezbollah war, that was very much different. And Iran is financially squeezed, and you can see that on the ground with Hezbollah, that there's not much money going around. So these three things, plus the domestic pressure they're under, their influence in Lebanon has also declined quite drastically, right, with the new president who is very pro-Gulf and pro-U.S., and the new government, the technocrats, and this pressure to disarm Hezbollah. Though the talks have not started locally for that, this is still massive pressure, and it shows you how much the group's influence in Lebanon has been degraded as well.
Donna, does that change? Of course, a lot of what you listed seems to be structural now in nature, but will the calculus change should the U.S. get involved militarily in the war?
That's a very good question, and I think everyone's asking this same exact question. That's the concern. If the U.S. joins this war, would Iran try to pressure the proxies to go in, or because this would mean the survival of the regime? Now, with the Houthis is a bit different. A lot of the experts who follow the Houthis really closely say they don't listen to Iran that much, and they're not ideologically linked to the regime as Hezbollah was before and even now. So the Houthis might not join. We saw just one coordinated strike between the Houthis and Iran, and that, of course, the Houthis are too far away, and sometimes those missiles don't even make it past the defense system. But yes, if the U.S. joins, the big question would be, would Iran play all of its cards, including, of course, not just U.S. assets in the region, but would it try to revive those proxies? For me, it's hard to see that as it's financially being squeezed and its own military capabilities also being squeezed. We're seeing it even rationing missiles maybe for that moment when the U.S. joins.
Yeah, with the Israeli military saying that they've wiped out, just in the last 7 days, about a third of Iran's missile defense systems. So steady erosion also of their own military defense systems. Dana, thank you so much for the reporting. Dana Khresh, Bloomberg's UAE Bureau Chief. Let's now bring in Dalia Fahmy, Director of International Relations and Diplomacy and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Long Island University. Dalia, good to have you with us. There's a lot going on, and perhaps the ambiguity when it comes to the U.S.'s exact intentions in Iran, though my colleagues at Bloomberg are reporting that U.S. officials have actually suggested that they are now preparing for the real possibility of military intervention in Iran over the coming days. How do you read these comments, and also just the lack of clarity that is coming through right now from the Trump administration?
You know, Jemana, if we just go back to December with the fall of the Syrian regime, and we were asking ourselves, you had me on asking, why at this moment? And we saw a weakened Iran, a weakened Russia, and that there was a possibility for us to rethink, the alignments of the international status quo. Just 7 days ago, last week, President Trump was actually talking about negotiations just hours before the bombings in Tehran, targeting military bases and facilities and even those residential buildings. President Trump was saying that he's committed to diplomacy. And so what's happened in these past 7 days that's dragged the administration into, now we're on the brink of language of entering into war, and to some extent even regime change war, where 6 months ago, was not on the horizon, and a week ago, we were talking about diplomacy. And so when we look at this, what was supposed to happen last Sunday in Oman, that 6th round of denuclearization talks, what happened to that negotiation horizon? That perhaps we were rethinking a region, especially with the fall of Assad, where we were talking about strategic realignments. It seems that all of that is now gone, or that we're aligning towards something very different.
Dalia, do you think there are going to be questions about the legality of this war? Israel has said that they're acting in a preventive self-defense. But as international law stands, unless an armed attack is imminent and unavoidable, such strikes are likely to be considered unlawful uses of force. Both U.S. intelligence, per the testimony of the Director of Intelligence to Congress back in March, and also the IAEA have said that there is no unequivocal evidence to suggest that Iran were on the path to build a nuclear bomb. Where does that leave the legality of this war?
So if you remember when Netanyahu actually pushed Trump to come off of Obama's nuclear deal, it was signaling a moment we were talking about a nuclear deal that was going to permanently prevent Iran for at least the coming couple of decades from reaching nuclear capacity. We know that they don't have nuclear capacity. They weren't that far in the enrichment capacity. But what we're talking about today is going into a country, perhaps even with the language of regime change and takeover, without international community authority. And so it begs a bigger question, Jemana, of what is the future of international human rights law, international law, even laws in the conduct of warfare, when countries can now have their borders violated without the kind of declaration of war, evidence-based declaration of war. Even here in the United States, what about the War Powers Act? What about the 45, 90 days? What does all of this mean today? It seems that we're moving away from an international norms-based world order that's really rooted in law. And that actually begs the question of how do we anticipate future relations between other nations in the international community when unfortunately we have leading global powers actually not de-escalating, but rather escalating towards forever wars.
Valid. Dalia, let me ask you about the mood in GCC countries? It's moved from one of, I would say, a lot of optimism about the state of the relationship between the Gulf and the U.S. after President Trump's seminal visit to the region only a month ago, to perhaps a lot of concern about what could happen next. How would you describe how Arab leaders are feeling right now and the real possibility of U.S. strikes on Iran?
There's a real level of uncertainty, not just with Arab leaders, with their action or inaction, but how their populations are going to respond. This comes after 2 years now of war in Gaza. This comes after we saw airstrikes in Beirut. We saw what's happening with the Houthis, what's happened in Syria. And so this kind of continuation of the Middle East is turning into a puzzle that is not yet really defined, creates a level of increasing uncertainty, not just with countries, but also with people. And so you're putting governments in a place where they need to respond to the frustration of their own populations, who are seeing people massacred regularly now on social media. And now we're seeing countries, especially GCC countries, having to see these airstrikes in their own airspace. A country like Qatar, for example, where does that leave it, where it has very large U.S. military capacity? If the U.S. doesn't indeed engage in war in Iran, how do you respond when these are countries that are not just very close to one another in proximity, but also have really deep economic, financial, and natural gas deals? They're very, in certain regards, very fragile to the kind of changing nexus of the region, very different than me here sitting in the United States. And so when we think about the ultimate, where we're headed, it's becoming more and more uncertain, and we're moving away from the norms of de-escalation rhetoric rather than to escalation rhetoric. And I think that is what we need to focus on. It's leading to a lot more uncertainty about what tomorrow is going to bring.
Dalia, thank you so much for your perspectives. Dalia Fahmy, Director of International Relations and Diplomacy and Associate Professor of Political Science at Long Island University. Thank you. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. Saudi Arabia's Flynas fell in its Riyadh trading debut as the war between Israel and Iran reverberates across regional equity markets and pressures airline stocks. Swinging between sharp losses and gains, trading was briefly halted twice in the first 20 minutes, but shares ultimately closed more than 3% lower at 77.3 riyals apiece. The Flynas listing marks the Middle East's largest IPO so far this year and is the first airline in the region to go public in almost 2 decades. U.S. safety investigators have called for urgent action to address an engine issue on Boeing 737 MAX aircraft that can cause smoke in the cockpit or cabin. The issue is linked to a malfunction in LEAP 1B engines made by GE Aerospace, which can happen when large birds strike. The agency wants regulators to ensure flight crews are alerted to the problem and that software modifications are implemented. And coming up, the International Atomic Energy Agency Director General, Rafael Grossi, has told Bloomberg there's no immediate danger of radiological contamination at Iran's Natanz nuclear site. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johanna Bersetchi in Dubai. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, says Iran's nuclear power plants should never be targeted in military strikes. Director General Rafael Grossi also told us the UN agency has found no concrete evidence that Tehran is actively pursuing a nuclear weapon.
No country in the world is enriching uranium at this level of 60%, which is technically almost equivalent of 90%, which is needed to have a nuclear weapon. At the same time, we are inspectors. We are not political analysts or national political officials. So we have to have concrete proof in order to say that there is an active program to make a nuclear weapon, which we have not seen. That doesn't mean that they are in a territory which is of concern. And this is the reason why there is international concern, why I had a very, I would say, serious report that I presented, as you may know, to the Board of Governors of the IAEA a few days ago.
Director General, there's a real question about what type of nuclear risk there is should there be some sort of explosion at some of these facilities. I know you've been directing a number of studies on this. What have you detected so far, and how concerned are you that a direct strike on Fordo in particular could release nuclear material into the environment?
If only a part of it is affected or more. But certainly the possibility of a radiological impact, environmental impact, exists. And as you also know, there are other facilities, including a nuclear power plant in Iran, which of course should never be touched, because this could be another level of concern and environmental damage. So this is what we see at the moment.
Director General, this is one reason why some people have speculated that there has been hesitance by Israelis as well as by the United States of truly dropping some of the bunker bombers and other types of military equipment to try to destroy some of this weaponry. Do you think that this is actually a real risk, the sort of release potentially of radiological material into the environment that you think people are taking seriously? Have you had conversations with the U.S. or Israel?
Well, we have reminded everyone, not that we need to be honest, because I think in the United States, you are the leading country in nuclear science and technology in the world. So I think there is complete awareness, and also in Israel and in Iran and in the region and in Europe. I'm talking to, and I would say in the Gulf states, I'm getting lots of calls from high officials, ministers, prime ministers. They are all very, very concerned about this probability. And I think, of course, I'm a diplomat. I'm not privy to military decision-making. But I want to believe, and I think this should be the case, that the potential radiological consequences of any military action is well taken into account. What is important is to return to the diplomatic table as soon as possible, because what is at stake is very serious.
Welcome back to the show. Some breaking news just coming through now. The IDF, the Israeli military, putting out a post on Twitter saying, on X, I should say, a direct hit has been reported at the Soroka hospital in southern Israel. So unclear at this point the extent of the casualties, extent of the damage. But what this is showing us is that a missile has managed to penetrate Israel's air defense system, and a hit has now been reported at a civilian hospital. So we'll keep an eye on developments there. Meanwhile, Iran's oil exports have jumped since the nation has come under attack. So their exports have jumped, according to data from TankerTrackers. The Islamic Republic exported an average of 2.33 million barrels a day since Israel first started bombing, an increase of 44% compared with the year through June 12th. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Dan Murtaugh. Surprising, Dan, you would not expect Iran's oil exports to be creeping upwards in the last 7 days. What do we know?
Well, Iran keeps a lot of oil, near the coast, in storage tanks, sort of ready to go. And they're obviously seeing, the chances of escalation. They want to get that oil out of there as fast as it can, put it on tankers, put it out into the ocean, try to find a buyer later. They don't want to see that oil, which is potential revenue, become one of the casualties of these bombings, and so they've been loading as fast as they can to get that stuff out of there, and that also gives them one less excuse not to potentially use their ability to block off the Strait of Hormuz once their exports are out of the way.
Interesting. Okay, really interesting data point. So let's see what happens with the flow of oil that's being exported out of Iran. But coming back to oil, obviously it's been super volatile the last couple of days, but net, we're still about 10% higher than pre-Israel launching these attacks on Iran. What are analysts saying could happen to the price of oil, say, if the U.S. were to decide to get involved militarily in the air campaign against Iran?
Yeah, well, so far, the price increase that we've seen in the oil market has all been basically just like adding a little bit of risk. But we haven't actually seen much impact to the flow of oil or gas through the Strait of Hormuz. The risk is if Trump comes in and the U.S. comes into the fighting, then Iran will have no more reason to hold back from what its sort of doomsday devices, and that's blocking the Strait of Hormuz, putting flaming tankers out there so no ships could pass. This strait, it's hard to overstate its importance to the oil and LNG markets. About 25% of the world's oil, 20% of the world's LNG go through it. If U.S. entry into the war makes Iran block that off, you could see prices go from, have gone up about $10 or so over the last couple of days to maybe another $20 or $30. And in the LNG market, it might be even more severe because the LNG market's been a bit tighter than oil this year. Goldman Sachs said today that you could see oil prices or LNG prices go up to $25 per MMBTU, which is about double the level they were at before the conflict started.
Yeah. Bloomberg's Dan Murtaugh, really good to have you on. Thank you for walking us through those figures from Iran. A look at equity futures as we head into what could be a really crucial couple of days geopolitically and in the region. All these equity markets are leaning towards the red. That is it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Johanna Bersecci in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.